In the recent live stream for the series The Chosen, they showed a rough cut of one of the upcoming scenes from season 3. It's a fun interaction between John and his brother James as they return home after the Sermon on the Mount. But there's actually so much more going on here that The Chosen just couldn't tell you in this brief scene. Right? Things like who these men really are in relation to Jesus, or where Capernaum is in relation to the location of the Sermon on the Mount, and why that is really significant, or why Zebedee says that he is the envy of all fathers in Capernaum. Right? There are all sorts of biblical, historical details that The Chosen just didn't have time to explain, but are so important to fully understanding the show and the scriptures that it portrays. So if you're interested in diving deeper into this scene and learning things that will forever change the way you see The Chosen and the Bible, then join me for this special episode of The Chosen Explained. In the first 2 seasons of The Chosen, one of the things that you can tell is that James and John are significant disciples. Right? They are central characters in many different scenes. Jesus gives them special responsibilities. They seem set apart from the other disciples. And the truth is, this is also how Scripture depicts them. Whenever Jesus' disciples are listed in Scripture, James and John are always among the first 4, along with Peter and Andrew. They are among Jesus' inner circle. They're present for the transfiguration, and they accompany Jesus when he goes to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane. But when we look even more closely at Scripture, we realize that in addition to their spiritual gifts, there might be another reason that they are so close to Jesus, which is that many scholars believe that James and John might actually be related to Jesus. You see, scholars will often combine several scriptures that give us reason to believe that James, John, and Jesus are cousins. When Matthew 27 and Mark 15 are placed side by side, it appears that James and John's mother is a woman we see throughout the Gospels named Salome. And if this is indeed who she is, this tells us that James and John's mother was present at several big moments in the Gospels. According to these verses, she was present at Jesus' crucifixion. According to Mark, she is present at the resurrection. And there's even reason to believe that she might be one of the women purported to have supported Jesus' ministry financially. But in addition to all of these, Scripture also shows us that John's mother might have been Jesus' aunt. You see, in John's Gospel, he says, near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Then, in Mark's Gospel, Mark says these women are standing near the cross. He says, some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and Joseph, and Salome. So taken together, if Mary the wife of Clopas is also the mother of James the younger, then that would suggest that Salome is the woman described by John as Mary's sister, which would make Jesus, James, and John cousins. And if this is true, it could also explain some other things in Scripture, like why John adopts Jesus' mother Mary after Jesus' death, and even why at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, Mary, his mother, is present at a wedding that Jesus attends with just a handful of his early disciples, most likely including James and John. Perhaps this was someone related to all of them, and perhaps they all were related. Now, another thing that stands out in this brief clip is the fact that these disciples are all returning from what appears to have been an extended stay away from home during the Sermon on the Mount. Right? They joke about who is having to carry the camping gear, and they act as if they haven't had their moms cooking for a while. Now, this definitely could have been how things unfolded. Right? I imagine that The Chosen is going to suggest that a lot of time went into preparing for the Sermon on the Mount and responding to everything that happened afterwards. Right? That they might even end up traveling throughout the region after the sermon, especially since John references these healings that they're experiencing. But one thing that you should know is that the Sermon on the Mount actually happened very close to where James and John lived. Right? When it comes to The Chosen, we are working from the assumption that Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount somewhere outside of Chorazim, since that is what the poster said in the final episode of season 2. And if that's the case, then James and John didn't have to journey far away from home. Chorazim is up on a hill just behind Capernaum. And depending on where you are, you can view one town from the other, which actually made me laugh at the line where Thomas jokes about how poor John's directions were, since, really, depending on how far on the outskirts of Capernaum Zebedee's house was, John could have possibly just pointed and said, hey, see that house right there? Right, the one with the hole in the roof when they dropped the guy down to be healed? The one that James here hasn't fixed yet? Yeah, that's our house. Right, because the truth is you can easily walk between these two towns, which I'm sure Jesus and his disciples did many, many times. In fact, in this month's newsletter, you can actually read a really funny story about the walk I took along this path during my recent trip to Israel. Just click the link right above here. And this is actually something that's really important to understand as you watch The Chosen and as you read the Bible. When you look at a map, right, or if you imagine these places in your mind, they can actually seem incredibly distant from one another. But the truth is, the area where Jesus lived and performed most of his ministry is very, very small. When you sit in a boat on the Sea of Galilee, you can see the entire lake and everything around it. As you stand in one town, you can actually see most of the others. Jesus and his disciples would have been used to walking everywhere. It would have only taken them a few hours at most to get to any of the towns in this area. The people in one city knew the people in the others, right? People from different cities married one another, especially since many people in a particular city would have actually been related to each other. And so it's no wonder that the news about Jesus spread so quickly, or how when he gets to a new town, people have already heard what he just did in the last town. Standing in these cities gives you an entirely new perspective on everything you read in Scripture and see in The Chosen. In fact, if you'd like to see one of these places or all of these places for yourself, I'll be helping to lead a trip next February 2023 that I'd love for you to join. You'll actually find details down in the description, or you can just click this link right up here. Now, the last thing that you may not have been clear on as you watched this brief clip was exactly why James and John's father Zebedee was so excited about them being disciples of Jesus. Right? Zebedee describes himself as the envy of all other fathers in Capernaum. Now, on one level, the reason for this might seem obvious. They're discipling with the Messiah. That's kind of a big deal. But even if Jesus weren't the Messiah, Zebedee would still have been incredibly excited. And in order to understand why, you have to understand something about Jewish culture and what it took to be a disciple. See, the truth is, few men ever got the chance to be disciples. For us, disciple feels like a generic term. We are all disciples making disciples. Not so at the time of Jesus. Being a disciple was a rare honor that few earned. You see, all Jewish boys started life with religious education. From 6 to 10, they'd be in something called Beit Sefer. This means house of the book. And for these 4 to 5 years, young boys would memorize significant portions of Scripture. They would memorize large portions of Genesis and Deuteronomy, a variety of Psalms. And some scholars believe that in some cases, boys would actually memorize the entire first 5 books of the Bible. Just imagine that. A 9-year-old memorizing all of this Scripture. Few of us today have more than a few verses memorized. I've got friends who still think Austin 3:16 is a verse. But back then, this was part of what every Jewish boy did. It was part of life. And if he excelled, if he showed real promise, then instead of going into the family trade, he would go to the next level, Beit Talmud. Now in Beit Talmud, boys would memorize the entire Old Testament, Genesis through Malachi, memorized. 929 chapters, 23,000 verses, over 600,000 words memorized. And they did all of this between the ages of 10 and 14. And if they showed real promise here, again, rather than going into the family business, they'd go to another level. And this last level was called Beit Midrash. In Beit Midrash, these young men would seek out a rabbi, a teacher of Jewish scripture, and they would study closely with him. They would follow him wherever he went, learn what he knew, say what he said, do what he did. They would want to be just like him. And they would give their lives to this pursuit. But here's what's so significant about James and John. When we meet them in Scripture and in The Chosen, they aren't sitting at the feet of a rabbi. They're fishermen. Because James and John never made it to Beit Midrash. They may have never even made it to Beit Talmud. At some point, someone looked at them and said, "You're not good enough. Go study with your father and learn the family trade." But when Jesus comes along, he says, "I don't care what the others say. I believe you are worthy, not just to be some other rabbi's disciple, but to be my disciples." I mean, this was a huge honor, not just for them, but for their entire family. No wonder Zebedee is the proudest father in the whole town of Capernaum. Any father would have felt that way. Their honor is his honor, and he celebrates it, right? He shouts it to the rooftops. The people of Chorazim probably heard him. It was so close, and he was so excited. And so with all of these things in mind, I want to invite you to go back and watch this scene again and consider how you see it differently. Right? Read through the Gospels and see how these insights change your perspective on things. And if you'd like to watch more videos on The Chosen, where I break down each episode and share with you details like these, then just click this link right over here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.